December 1942, somewhere over the Solomon Islands. A 19-year-old waist gunner named Eddie Kowalski stands in the belly of a B-17, hands gripping a Browning M2 that's vibrating like a jackhammer. A Japanese Zero slides into view at his 10E, maybe 300 yards out, moving left to right across his field of vision like a dart. Eddie does exactly what every instinct in his body tells him to do. He puts the crosshairs directly on the enemy plane's fuselage and squeezes the trigger. 50 rounds scream out. Tracer fire arcs through the air, and Eddie watches every single bullet pass harmlessly behind the Zero's tail. The Japanese pilot doesn't even take evasive action. He just keeps flying, completely untouched, while Eddie's ammunition counter spins down toward empty. This wasn't Eddie's failure. This same scene played out thousands of times across every theater of World War II during those early years. American gunners, well-trained, motivated, and equipped with the finest machine guns ever manufactured, were missing. Not occasionally, constantly. The Army Air Forces conducted a study in early 1943, analyzing gun camera footage from bomber missions over Europe and the Pacific. The findings were humiliating. U.S. bomber crews were firing enormous volumes of ammunition and scoring almost no hits during crossing attacks. Air gunnery schools had trained them perfectly for a kind of air combat that no longer existed. The battlefield had evolved, but the doctrine had not. And because of that mismatch, an enemy pilot in motion was effectively invisible to the men trying to kill him. The strange truth, one almost no one understood yet, was that the gunners were aiming exactly where they were told to aim. And that was the problem. They were firing at where the fighter was, not where it would be. They were doing everything right, and that was precisely why they were failing. Soon, someone would begin breaking the rules, and everything would change. The Army Air Force's analysis produced a number so embarrassing that it was initially withheld from most training officers. Of all the air-to-air kills claimed by bomber gunners in 1942, barely 1 in 10 could be confirmed. The other 90% weren't near misses. They were complete whiffs, ammunition dumped into empty sky. But the most shocking part wasn't that they were missing, it was why. The engineering teams expected to find a mechanical explanation. Unstable gun mounts, vibration, sight misalignment, ammunition spread. But the cameras told a different truth. The gunners were aiming exactly where the target was, not where it was going to be. They treated the air like it was solid ground, like shooting a deer in a field, put the crosshair on the animal and fire. But aerial combat doesn't work that way. When two aircraft are closing at a combined speed of 400-500 mph, what the gunner sees is already outdated by the time he reacts. By the time a bullet leaves the barrel, travels 300+ yards, and reaches the space where the enemy plane used to be, the target has already moved. Even a 0.3 second difference in timing meant the bullet stream passed yards behind a Zero, Messerschmitt, or Focke-Wulf. And in the air, yards might as well be miles. The study found that bomber gunners were perfectly accurate at seeing the enemy, but catastrophically inaccurate at predicting them. They were losing not because they couldn't shoot, but because they didn't understand motion. A Japanese Zero crossing at 300 mph at a shallow angle needed a full aircraft length of lead, sometimes 2 or 3 in a steep crossing angle, to land a hit. But no one had taught these 18 and 19-year-old farm boys from Iowa or steelworkers from Pennsylvania how to calculate deflection in a moving 3D environment. Their training films were built on still targets. Their gunnery ranges used tow banners flying predictable straight lines. Their instructors taught aim at the enemy. But in the real sky, aiming at the enemy meant missing the enemy. To make matters worse, adrenaline amplified the error. Combat turns the human brain into a tunneling machine. Target fixation locks you onto a shape, not its future position. So when tracers streamed behind the tail, gunners would correct the wrong direction. They tightened their aim on the fuselage, when they actually needed to aim even further ahead. Instructors watching the gun camera reels began referring to this problem with a grim nickname: the ghost silhouette. The fuselage in the crosshair was a phantom, a trap, a place the enemy had already left by the time the trigger was pulled. And so the question became, how do you break a soldier's instinct? Because this wasn't a matter of practice or better eyesight. It required retraining the human brain to anticipate motion in a way it wasn't naturally wired to do. Rifle training teaches front sight, rear sight, target. Air gunnery required a fourth component: prediction. The Army Air Forces realized they weren't fighting a shortage of ammunition. They were fighting a shortage of time. A zero closing from 500 yards could reach gun range for only 3 or 4 seconds. If a gunner spent 2 of those seconds simply finding the plane in his sights, the window of lethality was already nearly closed. By early 1943, the Air Forces reached a stark conclusion. Unless gunners learned to shoot ahead of what they saw, they would keep losing. It wasn't courage they lacked. It was geometry. This revelation would lead to one of the most radical changes in aerial marksmanship training in U.S. history. A new doctrine that would eventually teach gunners to fire behind the enemy to hit them head-on, a tactic that defied instinct but doubled kill rates. But before that doctrine could be taught, the Army first had to find a way to reprogram perception itself. The officers reviewing the gun camera footage quickly realized that the problem wasn't marksmanship at all. It was human perception itself. The human eye and brain are wired for survival on the ground. We track motion in a flat, horizontal world where speed is limited and trajectories are predictable. A running deer at 25 mph is easy for the eye to follow. A fighter aircraft crossing a bomber's path at 300 mph is not. The bomber gunners weren't failing because they were careless. They were failing because biology hadn't evolved for aerial combat. Psychologists from MIT and the University of Chicago were brought in to help analyze the gun camera data. Their findings were blunt. The nervous system lags behind reality by roughly 250 milliseconds. In an aerial duel, that fraction of a second is the difference between a hit and a clean miss. By the time a gunner saw the zero in his sight, his brain was already reacting to where the zero had been, not where it was now. Even worse, the gunner's tracers, meant to help them adjust, were actually reinforcing the wrong instincts. When a string of bright orange tracers arced past a fighter's tail, the rookie gunners instinctively walked the aim toward the silhouette. They were tightening their aim onto the mistake, instead of away from it. The tracers became a visual trap, a psychological gravity well that dragged men into missing twice in a row. The cognitive scientists who reviewed the footage gave the Army a diagnosis nobody had expected. This wasn't a marksmanship problem. It was a timing problem. The pilots of attacking fighters weren't winning because they were better. They were winning because the American brain had not yet learned how to think ahead of the present. So the next question became, how do you teach a 19-year-old to fire at something that isn't yet there? How do you train anticipation, not reaction? Instructors began experimenting with exercises that removed the enemy plane entirely. Instead of aiming at a visible target, they asked gunners to aim into empty sky, a point ahead of the fighter's path where the aircraft would be 1/2 second later. It felt alien, counterintuitive, almost backward. Men who had grown up squirrel hunting in the Midwest or duck hunting along southern rivers found themselves fighting their own instincts. They were learning to fire ahead of reality. The Army called this new way of thinking deflection shooting. But the first wave of gunners gave it a darker name: shooting ghosts. The problem was that instinct fights the mind during a dogfight. You see a plane, your pulse spikes, your hands tighten, you want to drill the threat. You can see, not some invisible point in space. Under stress, the brain shrinks its processing range to the target itself. It stops predicting and starts reacting. The training reformers understood that if they didn't break this instinct on the ground, it would kill men in the air. That realization led to the first major redesign of the gunnery curriculum in the war. Instead of starting with the weapon, the Army would now start with the physics of motion, teaching that the air is not a shooting gallery, but a moving geometry puzzle in 3 dimensions. A zero slicing across a bomber's the nose at 45 degrees wasn't a plane passing by. It was a future collision point waiting to be exploited. Trainers began saying it plainly. You're not shooting at the airplane. You're shooting at where the airplane it will be when your bullet arrives. But that required something deeper than explanation. It required rewiring. The next step would involve a radical shift in training tools. New simulators, optical trick devices, and eventually a system so effective that pilots started calling it cheat mode for the mind. Before the technique could double kill rates, it had to do something even harder. It had to retrain human intuition. The breakthrough didn't arrive from a marquee laboratory or a stern-faced general. It arrived dirty, late at night, inside a flight line hangar where veteran gunners tinkered with what the manuals told them to do, and then quietly tried the opposite. Sergeant Jack Moran was one of those veterans. He'd flown dozens of missions and watched tracers sweep uselessly by enemy tails until his ammunition drums were empty. He hated wasting rounds. One evening, poring over gun camera reels with a few other seasoned waist and tail gunners, Moran noticed a pattern few officers had seen. When a fighter crossed at a very shallow angle, tracers that had been aimed directly at the fuselage routinely sailed behind the plane. But on a handful of reels, almost by accident, a gunner who had paused, waited an extra half-second, and then fired produced impacts that bloomed across the enemy's wings. The footage was grainy, the hits small, but they were real. What if we started firing not at where he is, but at where he's going? Moran asked aloud. It sounded sacrilegious. It sounded like losing your nerve. Yet the grainy proof on the reel wouldn't lie. They set up a crude experiment the next dawn. Instead of live combat, they used the range. Towed sleeve targets and small, fast-moving targets to simulate crossing fighters. Gunners first trained the old way. Aim on the plane, squeeze, watch tracers fly past. Then they were told to delay their squeeze just a beat, to watch the target pass their initial aim, and then fire at the empty space ahead of it. It felt unnatural. Several men flinched, wanted to correct toward the silhouette. But the results were obvious. Hits increased dramatically when they held that half-beat. When they fired a fraction of a second behind the target's current position, which translated to its future position by the time the bullets arrived. Word spread. The experiment moved from hangar to simulator. Optical rigs were built. A moving target on rails with an adjustable speed and angle, an aim point light that could be toggled to force gunners to practice anticipating rather than reacting. Gunnery instructors devised drills where trainees would be penalized if they fired at the visible silhouette. Aim for the ghost, the instructors barked. Aim for the place he'll be. It took stubborn practice. Men who had shot skeet and deer since childhood had instincts to follow. Combat stressed those instincts ruthlessly. But the new drills rewired reflexes. Trainees learned to translate closure rate, the combined velocity of both planes, into a mental offset. A 45-degree crossing at 300 meters demanded a full aircraft length of lead. As they rehearsed, gun camera reels from training showed a quiet revolution. Tracers stopped arching harmlessly behind tails and began knitting into the enemy's fuselage and wings. Then came the first operational confirmation. On a cloudy mission over Europe, an old crew with a reputation for poor gunnery returned with an after-action radio call that made intelligence officers sit up. "We put rounds where the enemy will be, and he flew into them," the tail gunner reported. Their gun camera proved it. A Messerschmitt crossed, the gunners waited an extra beat, fired into a calculated empty space, and watched the fighter explode as it reached that point. The kill was certified. What had felt like a counterintuitive gamble was suddenly doctrinally exciting. The Army Air Forces began to collect the reels, to quantify the effect. Trainers crafted a simple rule of thumb. In many crossing passes, fire a fraction of a second late rather than early. Instructors coined a mantra to break instinct. Lead the future, don't chase the past. It was not magic. It was geometry translated into habit. The delay compensated for human reaction time and bullet travel time. It converted an enemy's motion into a predictable intercept point. What had been dismissed as shooting behind the enemy was actually the only way to place round after round into where the fighter would be when the bullets arrived. By the time the doctrine trickled into operational briefings, kill rates began to climb. The change was simple to state, difficult to master, and devastatingly effective in practice. Men who had once emptied belts in frustration were now watching fighters fly straight into their tracers. Not because the pilot was foolish, but because the gunners had learned to be ahead of their own instincts. Once field gunners proved the concept in combat, that shooting behind the target was actually shooting ahead of its arrival point in time. Army Air Forces leadership had a problem. This wasn't just a training trick anymore. It needed to be formal doctrine, and that meant science had to translate what the veterans had felt into something teachable, repeatable, and scalable. In early spring of 1943, the AF convened a cross-theater evaluation team, mathematicians, aerodynamicists, ballistics engineers, and gunnery officers from both the European and Pacific fronts. They sat around long briefing tables surrounded by gun camera film, training logs, weapon test data, and after-action reports from crews who had tried the new method in combat. The early statistical breakdown stunned them. When gunners aimed directly at an enemy fighter in a 30 to 60-degree crossing pass, hit probability dropped to under 8%. When gunners delayed their fire and aimed behind the plane's current visible position, hit probability jumped to 27–34%, depending on angle and closure rate. That was more than a marginal bump. That was a doctrinal earthquake. The scientists now had a duty. Explain why it worked, not merely that it did. They started with two brutal facts of air combat. Human reaction time is slow. Even a highly trained gunner takes about 0.2 of a second to see a target, register it, and fire. Bullets take time to reach the target, especially across hundreds of yards. Another 2 to 0.5 of a second depending on distance. That means a half second to 3/4 of a second often elapsed between decision and impact. In air combat, half a second is everything. At 300 miles per hour, a fighter covers more than 200 feet in that time, literally shifting its position dozens of aircraft lengths before the bullets ever arrive. So when a gunner aimed on the plane, he was effectively aiming where the target had been an eternity ago in air combat time. The Zero or Messerschmitt had already moved far ahead of the intercepted bullet stream. Instructors later translated it into a brutal sentence. You're not missing because you're inaccurate. You're missing because you're late. Charts were drawn. Closure rate graphs overlaid angular deflection. A mathematician from MIT drafted a simplified formula that gunnery instructors jokingly nicknamed the farmer's equation because it was instinctual rather than academic. More angle plus more speed, more ghost space to fire into. That ghost space, the invisible spot in front of the enemy's nose or wing line, became the new aiming point. But just explaining it wasn't enough. The AAF needed muscle memory. So a revolution began inside training schools from Harlingen to Kingman to Wendover. New deflection simulators, rotating track targets, offset sighting drills, and eventually the famous Waller flexible gunnery trainer. A giant mechanical VR machine decades before anyone called it that. Trainees stood inside a half-cylindrical theater of projection screens, showing enemy fighters attacking. The gunners had to track and fire with realistic recoil simulation. And if they fired on the plane rather than ahead of it, the hit scorer registered a block of angry zeros. Men cursed it at first. Then they improved. Then they saw the film. Then they believed. By mid-1943, instructors noticed something startling. Replacement gunners arriving fresh from training were already outperforming veteran crews still clinging to instinctive target-chasing fire. The doctrine wasn't just correct, it was contagious. Crews began writing home about it. Intelligence reports noted Japanese and German pilots abruptly breaking off intercepts more frequently, because bombers were actually killing them now. A tactical philosophy had become a geometry lesson, which had become a reflex. The science had finally caught up to the battlefield, and for the first time in the war, the U.S. wasn't merely surviving enemy fighter attacks, they were counter-hunting. By late 1943, the change was no longer subtle. Bomber formations that once braced for helpless incoming slaughter were now bleeding the attackers dry. What had started as a desperate correction in deflection timing evolved into something larger. An attitude shift. Gunners were no longer passengers waiting to die behind armor plate. They were predators with geometry on their side. In after-action debriefs, bomber crews began describing something the air forces hadn't heard in 2 brutal years of war. Confidence. Tail gunners reported firing before a fighter entered the ideal shooting lane, laying an invisible curtain of fire into the enemy's future flight path. Waist gunners developed timing slang. Ghosting meant firing early into the off angle. Hooking meant dragging the fire into where an attacker would roll out of a dive. The sky was no longer reactive chaos. It was predictive terrain. And when confidence hardens into doctrine, it spreads. The doctrine becomes a weapon. The 8th Air Force began wide-scale doctrinal memos, not just about deflection fire, but how entire formations could exploit it. Instead of each gunner fighting a personal duel, the bomber box became a mesh of overlapping predictive fire. Fighters diving through it were no longer threading a needle. They were flying through a forecasted kill zone. Kill confirmations surged. Not slowly, abruptly. Luftwaffe squadron diaries from late 1943, record-growing shock among German pilots. They weren't just encountering more aggressive gunners, they were encountering mathematically armed ones. Crossing attacks that used to be nearly safe suddenly became fatal. One German pilot was recorded saying after capture, "The Americans no longer shoot at us, they shoot where we must fly." That quote circulated in briefing rooms like a trophy. Veteran revolt, in the other direction. Ironically, some of the oldest gunners struggled the most to adopt the change. They had seen so many dead friends, so much helpless firing into empty sky, that their instincts had calcified. A few insisted the new technique was luck, or theory dreamt up by staff officers who never fired a gun in their lives. But reality is a ruthless teacher. The first veteran who refused to retrain died on his next mission. Others noticed. One master instructor at Kingman put it bluntly in a chalk talk. "Gentlemen, this is not magic. This is travel time. You are not pulling a trigger at a fighter. You are pulling a trigger at the future." Men repeated the phrase until it stuck. Fire at the future. The bomber box evolves. With predictive gunnery now standardized, the Air Forces made another leap. They altered formation geometry itself. Instead of building tight formations only for overlapping arcs of defense, they reorganized spacing so gunners could maintain better lead angles on high-speed crossing passes. The whole formation was now shaped not merely to survive, but to trap fighters in predictable fences of lead. The shift was psychological as much as tactical. German pilots who once screamed in for head-on passes now hesitated. A half-second of fear was all the new doctrine needed to tear them out of the sky. The music of Kill Zone's gun camera footage began capturing something never seen before in the war. Fighters exploding inside empty air, bursting apart at a point ahead of their nose before they ever lined up properly on a bomber. A German FW-190 rolls into an attack, but the guns are waiting at the intercept, not the fuselage. The result is instantaneous amputation mid-flight. The AAF understood what had happened. Bombers were no longer prey. They had learned to become ambush predators, and predators change wars. This wasn't the final transformation. That would come when gunners learned to read enemy evasions in advance, but this moment marked the pivot. The day American bombers stopped trying not to die and started hunting the hunters was the day Axis air superiority began to decay from within. The geometry of survival had become the arithmetic of death, and every Zero or Messerschmitt that dared cross a bomber's horizon now had to move through time itself, weaponized. By early 1944, the doctrine had matured beyond simply fire ahead of the target. Now the best crews weren't just predicting movement. They were predicting intent. What separated average gunners from the deadly ones wasn't accuracy. It was anticipation. A veteran gunner no longer waited to see what maneuver a fighter was doing. He read the enemy's setup and began firing into the maneuver the fighter hadn't executed yet. This was the second quiet revolution, from geometry to mind reading. Enemy fighters didn't just move randomly. Each attack profile had a telltale signature before the actual firing run. Slight nose dip before a high side roll, a throttle flare before a fast slashing pass, a wing rock before a shallow deflection dive. The momentary pause before a head-on feint. The new predictive gunnery taught American crews to watch the commit moment, the instant a fighter chose its attack line. And once a fighter committed, it could not change vectors before entering the firing arc. That micro moment, half a second, sometimes less, was the window in which a good gunner became a lethal one. Instead of chasing the silhouette, advanced gunners ambushed the attack profile itself. The invisible net gunnery instructors began using a phrase during advanced training. Don't shoot at the fighter, shoot at the decision. The most elite crews could identify which maneuver a German or Japanese pilot had chosen before the maneuver fully unfolded. They laid fire into the curve the enemy was about to fly. The result looked eerie on film. Rounds blooming into empty sky. And then, a heartbeat later, the fighter materialized into the bullets, as if pulled by a string. Enemy pilots began reporting impossible hits. They thought Americans had faster guns or new sights. What they had were faster brains trained to weaponize intent. The first mass shock event, the breakthrough, stunned Axis air units during one famous mission over Western Germany. A formation of B-17s shot down 11 fighters in under 4 minutes, 7 of them during maneuver entry, before they had even begun firing back. A captured Luftwaffe Oberfeldwebel later described the shock. It was as if they already knew our direction of attack before we set it. We were flying into traps in the air. The Americans weren't lucky. They had learned to read body language in engine noise and wing angles. Predictive timing becomes standard. The AAF quickly redesigned debrief sheets. Instead of rating marksmanship, instructors now rated attack recognition speed maneuver, anticipation vector prediction timed fire discipline. The question was no longer, can you hit him? It was, can you fire before he becomes hittable? That jump, from reaction to preemption, created a new class of gunners unofficially called Reapers. They didn't wait to return fire. They clipped wings at the moment of commitment, when a fighter had the least freedom to break away. The psychological break-by, mid-1944. German and Japanese ace pilots, men who once relished bomber intercepts, began refusing certain angles of approach altogether. They had seen too many squadron mates die in the anticipation zone, A Zero pilot captured over the Marianas put it bitterly. They are shooting at thoughts now. That wasn't poetry. It was diagnosis. The Americans had successfully moved the fight one step backward in time. First they learned to fire ahead of position, then ahead of decision. Now, gunnery wasn't a defensive reflex. It was counter-ambush warfare in the sky. A mental duel fought 1/2 second before the first tracer ever flew. And once bombers could kill a fighter before it was even in the firing pass, the balance of the air war tilted permanently in their favor. By the summer of 1944, the transformation was fully visible from the enemy's perspective. What Axis pilots had once treated as lumbering prey, slow, predictable, clumsy giants, had become something far more terrifying. Airborne gun platforms that could anticipate, counter-trap, and punish an attacker before the attacker even stabilized his aim. And the shock wasn't gradual. It hit like a brick wall. The first intercept that didn't make sense. German intelligence officers interviewing surviving pilots began recording a new and disturbing complaint. The Americans are firing when we are still setting our attack. They are not waiting for us to engage. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Bomber gunners had historically been reactive. The fighter dictated tempo, angle, and timing. But now, the bomber boxes were dictating the geometry of the fight. Fighters weren't choosing their engagement windows anymore. They were walking into pre-plotted kill zones. For the first time, fighters were the ones on the clock. The behavior shift. Enemy pilots began to alter their approach patterns, not tactically, emotionally. They came in cautious instead of bold. They hesitated longer on roll-ins. They tested openings before committing. That hesitation, a single, poisonous half-second, was fatal. The new American doctrine fed on hesitation. If a pilot delayed even for the blink of an eye, the gunners already had the vector plotted and the firing envelope pre-timed. The hunters were now being hunted inside their own decision loops. Kill ratios. Flip the narrative before predictive gunnery. U.S. bomber defensive fire averaged roughly 1 fighter kill per mission group. By late 1944, some formations were logging 8 to 12 kills in a single sortie. Many of them downed during the approach, not the firing run. And in the Pacific, Zero drivers, once legends of early war dominance, began refusing 90-degree crossing attacks entirely. They were simply dying too quickly. The Japanese Naval Air Bureau issued a classified assessment in September 1944 that contained a quiet admission. American gunners now fire as if they know the future trajectory of our aircraft. They were not exaggerating. The psychological collapse. What cracked first was not aircraft. It was morale. Bomber crews who once prayed just to survive a mission now talked casually about tally counts. Air gunners swapped tips the way earlier crews swapped cigarettes. A rookie who shot down a fighter was no longer a miracle story. It was expected output. Meanwhile, German and Japanese squadron leaders began instructing rookie pilots to avoid certain attack lanes entirely. The most historically effective approach vectors, high-speed crossing passes, had become suicide patterns. Predictive. Gunnery had erased an entire repertoire of attack options. The sky no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe intelligence. Eventually summed up the new reality in 4 chilling words. They are pre-aiming time. Everything had inverted. Before 1943, bombers were targets. Fighters were executioners. By late 1944, bombers were traps. Fighters were prey. The Axis hadn't simply lost an air duel. They had lost temporal initiative itself. The Americans had seized the half-second where the future becomes the present, and turned it into a weapon. The sky no longer rewarded aggression. It punished it. The hunters were now the ones flying into jaws they couldn't see, and couldn't evade. But the Americans weren't done evolving yet. The final breakthrough was still coming, one that didn't just punish commitment, but baited it on purpose. By the spring of 1944, the training shift had become unmistakable. American aerial gunnery wasn't merely catching up. It was evolving into something close to a science. The lessons that had begun as crude chalkboard diagrams in damp Quonset huts were now being drilled into air crews with mathematical precision. Don't fire at where the enemy plane is, fire at where it will be. The old instinct had to die for the new muscle memory to live. But weaponizing geometry wasn't enough. What transformed the kill ratio wasn't just better theory. It was the collision of 3 elements: training realism, predictive thinking, and the invention of mechanical assistance that shortened human reaction time. No matter how brilliant a gunner was, he still had one limitation. The human brain could only estimate lead so quickly. Zeros, FW-190s, BF-109s. They all used speed and oblique angles to overwhelm the delay built into human vision and nerve response. So the US began developing devices that augmented the gunner's judgment. The biggest breakthrough was the computing gun sight, specifically the Mark 14 and its siblings. Instead of lining up iron crosshairs like a Civil War rifleman, the gunner now used gyros and analog computation. The gun sight didn't just show where the enemy was, it predicted where he would be based on turn rate and angular movement. A gunner simply caged the target in the reticle, and the sight automatically calculated deflection. Instead of the brain doing the trigonometry, the gun sight did. This mechanical leap turned experience into automation and reaction into prediction. Suddenly, a 19-year-old with 6 missions could shoot like a veteran on his 30th. His bullets no longer streaked behind enemy planes like taillights on a rainy street. They began cutting into cockpits. But a new mindset had also taken root. Gunners were now instructed to track trajectory, not silhouette, the path, not the plane. Firing wasn't a reflex anymore. It was an ambush. Another powerful consequence emerged from this new doctrine: coordinated fire. Before 1943, bomber gunners often fired individually, each turret defending its own door, so to speak. But dogfighting against fighters wasn't a static exercise. Luftwaffe pilots made approach runs at specific geometries: head-on, high side, or low six. Japanese pilots, especially early war A6M0 aces, preferred high curved energy spirals and vertical dives. Once US instructors recognized these consistent attack patterns, they trained bomber crews to swing turrets into shared fire lanes, not independent fields of fire. Two overlapping streams of deflection fire created what German pilots later called flying walls of iron. Some Luftwaffe debriefs described it more bluntly: you weren't fighting gunners, you were flying into mathematics. The psychological shift was just as important. Instead of panic fire based on fear, the new doctrine taught gunners to delay the first burst until the firing solution was optimal. Early war rookies squeezed too soon, wasting ammunition in blind hope. Late war gunners held their trigger discipline like snipers. Short, lethal bursts replaced panicked sprays. At 300 yards, the optimal kill zone, a well-led bomber defense network, could now chew through even heavily armored FW-190A8s that earlier would have slipped away untouched. Bomber crews learned to time bursts so that attacking fighters entered their envelope as the geometry peaked, like walking into a tripwire they never saw. By mid-1944, after-action reports no longer read like lists of escapes and near misses. They read like anatomy charts. Wings severed at the root. Engine compartments shredded. Coolant lines ruptured. Canopy glass atomized. American training had caught up and then surpassed. This wasn't luck. It wasn't prayer. It was mathematics turned into marksmanship, and instinct rewired into prediction. The US had figured out not how to hit enemy fighters, but how to make missing them mathematically unlikely. By the end of the war, the numbers told the story more clearly than any headline ever could. In 1942, it often took tens of thousands of rounds to bring down a single attacking fighter. By late 1944, that number had fallen by more than half, and in certain bomber groups with top-tier training, it was reduced by nearly 2/3. The difference wasn't new guns, new ammunition, or new armor. It was new thinking. Gunners weren't pulling the trigger at the enemy anymore. They were firing into the space the enemy was about to enter. In practical terms, that meant shooting behind the position of the target as currently seen, so the arc of the bullets and the motion of the attacker would intersect. What looked like bad aim to a civilian observer was actually the purest form of anticipation. They were no longer reacting to the past. They were shooting into the future, and enemy pilots felt it. German after-action intelligence briefs in 1944 start sounding palpably frustrated. American bombers now appear able to strike accurately while maneuvering. Japanese Navy reports carried a darker tone. Formerly, many could press the attack with little concern. Now the approach is itself dangerous. The hunters no longer owned the angles. In just 2 years, the US had turned undisciplined instinct into predictive discipline, and with it, rewrote the balance of the air war. The shift didn't just save bomber crews. It flipped survivability into lethality. The lesson would outlive the war. The most dangerous marksman isn't the one who sees you. It's the one who knows where you'll be next.